Welcome to the herd and thanks for listening. We're happy to help you have informed conversations with your healthcare providers, but please do not treat anything we say in this or any of our episodes as medical advice, even when the guests are physicians. They're not your physician. If you enjoy this sodcast, please like it, share it, give it a good rating, and follow, and help more people find their way into the Ruminati herd. If you have suggestions for improvements, please let me know. Howdy, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Meet Your Herdmates Sodcast. I am so pleased today to be joined by one of the original Sod sisters. Yeah, put that on your resume. So, Dr. Georgia Ede, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, well, it is just a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm proud to be part of the herd.
And we are better off for it. So for people who don't know who Georgia Ede is and how could that possibly be the case, you are Harvard trained, board certified psychiatrist, and you're based in Western Massachusetts. We'll talk about a lot of that, but I first became aware of you at an ancestral health symposium in 2012, where you were giving a presentation that made me kind of go, wow, that's really interesting stuff. So over the years since then, you've been, I think, is it fair to say that you've been an early participant in the field called nutritional psychiatry? Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, there aren't there are different branches of nutritional psychiatry. You know, the sort of old school branch was using supplements instead of medications, and that branch goes back quite a ways. And I was never really part of that branch. But this
Okay.
new branch is about thinking about the quality of one's diet, like dietary quality and the metabolic quality of the diet and how that might influence brain health. And so there are not very many of us doing that kind of work, just a handful really around the world, but it's taking off all of a sudden, really in the past year or two. Suddenly all kinds of articles are popping up in scientific journals about this topic. So it's really exciting field and really empowering for people who struggle with mental health problems, which is many, many, many people.
Mhm. So I remember you making this radical statement about the connection between the brain and the body, and scientific discoveries, and so I don't want to mess up your line if but basically that science has conclusively proved that the brain is part of the body.
Yes, yes. I don't know if you remember that old, was it some kind of a toothpaste commercial or something? 4 out of 5 dentists and 4 out of 5 scientists agree that the brain is part of the body.
Okay, good. I like it. So there's a number of things. I spoke with Amy Berger and the energy issue, um, and you've spoken about that as well. On the other part that is becoming as fascinating to me is just the question of what it takes to build a brain and a nervous system as well as a body. And so when as I am becoming more and more aware of the issues of global sustainable food systems and human beings in other parts of the world, primarily low and middle income countries, this issue of the nutrition that the expectant mother, the nursing mother, and her child need so that the brain develops properly, so that that person can achieve their potential as a human being. And so you've helped me a number of times kind of clarify there's nutrients that we get from animal source foods. There's nutrients we get from plant source foods. Sometimes they're labeled the same, but they really aren't. Some of those are only from animal source foods. Some of those are best sourced from animal source foods. So I know that's a lot. I'll help us through that conversation. But I really think that's important because a lot of the story is that we must have these, we can get these from plants in some cases. So let's start with the things that it takes to build a healthy brain.
First of all, thanks very, very much for starting with that question, because that is the fundamental, I mean, literally the question that's going to determine the future mental health of the human race. It is that important. And if we get this wrong, it can have consequences, negative consequences for generations. And we really don't talk about this enough. And so I'm really glad you're highlighting that. And that's really, when I learned about not just what it takes to build a healthy brain, but where best to get those nutrients, I became really passionate about the topic and wrote a lot about it and spoke a lot about it, because especially young women, not just in this country, but around the world, many of them have the wrong information about what a healthy diet is. And unfortunately, for better or for worse, women bear the responsibility, those who decide to have children, of feeding the brains of future generations. And that is, it's critically important. So your question is, what does it take to build a healthy brain? And the answer is all of the essential vitamins and minerals, and all the B vitamins and vitamin A, and every vitamin, every mineral that we already know is essential. And it takes protein and fat, but certain types of fat are particularly important. So you need to have everything you would think you would need. It's actually not that surprising. Most of it makes perfect sense, and most of it wouldn't surprise anybody, except when it comes to the fat. So you can get protein from plants or animals, your choice. But if you get the protein from plants, you have to, in many cases, jump through some hoops or contend with some challenges in order to get the nutrients you need from those foods, because those foods aren't just sources of protein. So if you're looking at, I mean, you know this very well. So if you're looking at, say a piece of fish, or if you're looking at a bean, yes, they both have protein in them, but they're not the same quality protein. And then what else is in those foods? Well, the fish has all kinds of other things you need, whereas the bean, not so much. And not only is the bean generally fairly low in most of the nutrients we need, it doesn't include some of them that we need, and it includes things that work against extracting and using the nutrients in the bean. So it's not the same. And so with protein, it matters. But if you carefully construct your diet with plant protein sources, you can get the proteins you need, and maybe if you supplement a little bit, you can get the other nutrients you need. But one thing that really most people don't understand is about the fats of the brain to build a healthy brain in the beginning of life. So just before pregnancy, during pregnancy, and the first 2 years of life, really the first 1,000 days of the human being's life, the brain is developing very, very rapidly, and it needs really rich sources of all of these micronutrients and especially these fatty acids, DHA and arachidonic acid. So DHA is an omega-3, and arachidonic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid. These exist only in animal foods. They do not exist in plant foods. So, these are extremely important signaling molecules. They're important for the development of the brain. They're important for electrical activity, for cell communication. They're important for the immune function of the brain. So if you don't have enough of those molecules, the brain is not going to develop properly. And you may never get another chance to undo whatever developmental damage may have been caused by the lack of those nutrients. So I'm convinced by the science, no matter how you look at it, that the developing human brain needs animal fat. And you can supplement your way around it. Nowadays, we now have algae oil supplements that contain DHA, for example. But even just a number of years ago, that wasn't possible. So these fats are incredibly important and really misunderstood. So I think that the plant-based philosophy that's become so popular around the world could have a lot of unintended consequences for developing children that we may never be able to repair.
Several things to pick up. In the literature and people working, so for example, FAO and other organizations, they talk about nutrients of concern in the sense of them being lacking. And I'm not sure, thinking about it right now, whether DHA shows up on the list. Typically, it's things like zinc, iron, B12, calcium, and I have to check that. I wouldn't want to make any firm statement on that, but clearly there's this range. There are a number of nutrients that tend to be low, especially in the diets of people who are living, for whatever reason, based on cereal-based diets in the low and middle income countries. And the thought of supplementing them is not a viable approach when you go outside of Western Europe, and North America. It's a different reality. And yet it doesn't take much animal source food to provide what's needed to fill out that diet. And so, again, we have conversations in one part of the world that can affect the other part of but they don't. They're not appropriate to the rest of the world. Now, a number of questions and my brain gets full. Forgive me.
Yeah, mine too.
So now I watched you. I was cramming for the interview, and you can see it didn't work. Will I never learn? There were two presentations that you gave last year to a CrossFit audience. One of those was looking at three specific. Well, it was the myth making. I have the title right here. Yes, brainwashing, but it was. No, what was the name of?
Was it Brainwashed, the mainstreaming of nutritional mythology?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And so you brought in an interesting take on that, but you also, perspective on that, insight is the word. But you also, in looking, for example, at the IARC cancer report, but if you could just talk about that chain of events that gave us what currently is, everybody knows that red meat, processed meat, blah, 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 because I found it quite remarkable when you told it in the way that you did. And if you can't recall, I'll try to prompt you through it. So we start with the press announcement.
Right. Yeah. So there are, in that presentation, what I tried to do was try to explain to people where these myths have come from about animal foods being unhealthy, and they've really primarily come from three very authoritative documents, very influential documents. So, one is the USDA dietary guidelines, one was the World Health Organization report on meat and cancer, and one was the Eat Lancet report. It came out in early 2019, and so each one of these reports, the USDA dietary guidelines came out a long time ago. WHO report on meat and cancer was 2015. And then the Eat Lancet was 2019. And each one of these documents becomes progressively more and more anti-meat in its messaging, to the point that the Eat Lancet document essentially recommends strongly recommends and wishes to enforce that the entire world eat a plant-based diet, eat a very, very low meat to no meat, really eliminate animal foods from the diet ideally. So it's a very extreme position. And all of these documents, they're really weighty. They're impenetrable if you try to read them. They're really, really difficult to read. And they also, they're written by very authoritative people, often very influential people and affiliated with very prestigious institutions. So the WHO report on meat and cancer that you're talking about, in 2015, they released a 2-page press report proclaiming to the world that red meat probably causes cancer. Processed meat definitely causes cancer. It was literally 2 pages with just I think 20 references in it. And it was taken as gospel immediately. Before the full report, which is, I can't remember how many hundreds of pages long, came out 2 or 3 years later, and nobody even looked at it or talked about it because everyone had already taken this 2-page press release as gospel. And when you look at the evidence that they use to support these anti-meat arguments, there's no there. There is just nothing there. When you actually if you look at the epidemiological studies, which some people in your audience may know, that epidemiology is just questionnaire-based guesses about food and health. They're not scientific experiments. So even the epidemiology, these guesses, were split right down the middle about whether meat is or is not associated with colon cancer, and right down the middle. So what are you going to do with that? And then there are just a handful, I think 6 experimental studies, extremely small, and only 3 of them, 2.5 of them actually, were done in humans. And they were so poorly designed that you can't make heads or tails out of what they mean. They're meaningless. They're very small. They were never reproduced. That is the evidence base for this worldwide proclamation that red meat causes cancer. There is no evidence at all. And that I'm sure that's the best evidence. If that's the best evidence you can find, that's pretty sad. So it suggests to me that something else is going on. Some other force is driving this message that is not about science and that's not about concern for human health. And I don't pretend to know what it is. Lots of theories, but a belief, repeated over and over again can start to sound like the truth. And I think that's what's happened.
Well, and as I recall, you actually read the references, the papers that were referenced in the press release, and went through them to get how many were actually in. I love your description of the rats. They're bred to be susceptible. They're injected with a carcinogen, and then we see if whatever the treatment was increased or decreased their rate of getting cancer. I mean, it's ridiculous. But beyond that, they actually cited studies saying things that the study itself didn't say, as I recall. So they're misreporting. And then, of course, they're failing to report anything that would seem to be at least cast doubt. And you had a quote from one of the board or committee members who said something about the experience.
Yeah, so that was David Clerfeld, who is a scientist with USDA, and he sat on the committee that generated this report, and he said it was one of the most frustrating experiences of his professional life. And what he was referring to was that there was a lot of anti-meat, pro-plant bias among many of the members of the committee that was just hard to penetrate and hard to reason with. And that ultimately the report reflected that bias over the factual information they had available.
And that potential conflict of interest, personal bias, was not clearly stated.
No, it never is. And I think it may be that they're not aware that it's a bias, and that maybe, I don't know.
Yeah,
They may not be aware that it's a bias, and that, this is just, of course, we all accept this as fact. So why should this be something that we
yeah.
disclose? This is just
They're
supposed to be
true
true.
believers. Yeah.
They're true believers. But I think that all of us should report our biases, and I work hard to do that in my presentations, to say, this is where I'm coming from and why, and you can decide if that colors how you think about the information I'm about to present to you. And but many times that's not the case in the research world. That's not the case, certainly on the WHO Cancer Committee. You have to look it up and find and learn for yourself that most of the people on the committee had really staked their professional lives and reputations. Their work was really about trying to show that plant-based diets were healthier.
And other guests have spoken about belief systems that predispose people to wanting to make that case. There's lots of reasons that people think that this might be the case. Many times those arguments are really outside of their expertise, but it informs how they go about working within their discipline. And then, as you said, it was about 4 years later that we got the Eat Lancet, which is a remarkable story because it's sort of a bait and switch, that they say one thing in all the press release, but then when challenged behind the scenes, so to speak, at least one of the people involved kind of does a 180 and says, no, 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 it wasn't about that, it was about this. Which is just, it's kind of remarkable behavior.
It is. Human beings are, I'm a psychiatrist, right? So human beings fascinate me. You don't have to be a psychiatrist to find them fascinating. But, reading the section of the Eat Lancet report, which I think was about 7 pages long, that focuses specifically on nutrition, the nutrition and health, because most of it is about the environment, the environmental impact of diet. That also didn't hold up to scrutiny, but the 7 pages about nutrition, it is just astounding when you read the report, what you're actually reading. So even though on the cover of the report and the summary of the report and the recommendations that come out of the report say, the conclusion is that, we would all be better off, both for our health and the planetary health and human health and animal health, will all be better off if we stop eating animal foods and we eat plants. But when you read the document, they're actually making an ironclad argument for the opposite. So they repeatedly acknowledge in the report, you can read it for yourself, they repeatedly acknowledge the superiority, the nutritional superiority of animal foods, the critical requirement for animal foods for growing children, for pregnant women, for teens, for aging seniors, et cetera, et cetera. The malnourished, the impoverished, they repeatedly say animal foods, the animal foods are required in these populations. And then everybody else in the sort of lower risk populations, I guess, needs to supplement. Because and what that suggests to me is that plant-based diets are nutritionally insufficient, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't ever say that. They spell it out and then they conclude the opposite. They know no one's going to read that report.
Mm-hmm.
They know people are going to trust them because they work at big institutions and they've got all this, money and power and influence and titles. They know no one's going to read that report with a critical eye, because if you do, it's laughable.
Mm-hmm. I recently sat in on something that, again, is of that level, involved with the United Nations, and it was about protein. And one of their fundamental documents was this table that attempted to show that animal source protein One of its negatives was probably causes diabetes and cancer and heart disease. I mean, they were very certain. They colored it bright red. They were very certain
Then it
about that.
must be true.
It must be true. And it's so, and I've sat in presentations where I see reports that they're actually trying to say how many people die every year due to a lack of fiber in their diet. They're counting fiber as an essential nutrient. I've been out of graduate school for a few years, so I may have missed something. When did fiber become an essential nutrient in the human diet? Do you know that?
Yeah, no, it's as fiber by definition is indigestible, and it doesn't provide any nutrients to the body. Doesn't mean you can't eat it. Doesn't mean it may not have other benefits for you as a human being, as you as an individual. But there's no dietary requirement for fiber. It doesn't provide anything essential. Whereas animal foods provide everything essential. So for some reason we've got it so upside down. Fiber is it's part of plant foods, and so if you eat plants, they contain fiber, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But there has never been any evidence, any scientific evidence that if you take fiber out of the diet, that human beings suffer any nutrient deficiencies of any kind. So, in fact, fiber can, in many cases, function as a sort of anti-nutrient by interfering, like physically interfering as a physical barrier to extracting nutrients from inside plants, because those rigid cell walls get in the way of being able to extract nutrients from inside of the plant cells. So it's really everything. It's upside down from the truth. There are plenty of people who feel better when they remove fiber from their diets. There are plenty of people who feel perfectly well when they include fiber in their diets. But fiber's not essential. It doesn't provide any essential nutrients to build or maintain a human body.
So the explanation perhaps for how we came to believe that was, again, based on a lot of associational epidemiological data, where and always interpreting that data through a lens of it must be the fat that's causing heart disease. People who eat more of these healthy foods are taking in more fiber. I think at one point it became attractive because it wasn't what was in, it was what was removed from the diet.
Right.
And so that idea of processing out the fiber, that must be the secret for why now all of a sudden people, but it is so it's hard for, well, one of the things, we don't use food frequency questionnaires in dairy cow nutrition.
No,
we know not to.
They don't fill out your questionnaires.
No. They lie.
It's hard to keep the pen in that little hoof.
Yeah, well, it's not so little. In some cases, and here's something else that I need to work on figuring out how to express. We in forage agriculture have been teaching farmers for many years about how variable the nutritional quality of hay can be. So a field of alfalfa and another field of alfalfa can be very different for a number of reasons. And from cutting to cutting, the same field within a year can be very different, et cetera, et cetera. So when all we had was book values, that's what we used. But as we learned more and more, we realized, no, we need to test every lot of hay because it varies so much. Well, hay is not the only plant food that varies from lot to lot. And when we have soybeans, for example, they can vary tremendously in crude protein content, as well as individual amino acid content, as well as anything else we want to quantify about. But all we use is I'm pretty sure we're not testing every lot that goes into the manufacturing process. I'm pretty sure we're not printing new labels for every lot that comes out of the manufacturing process. So people who are trying to pay attention to macronutrient composition, whatever, I'm beginning to wonder where they're not being given the information that they need to even do that, even if that was a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to me. And the other thing that brings up is, that so many foods in the supermarket have a nutrition label. If meat had a nutrition label, you would easily be able to see how nutritious it was. But I think people really are completely blind to it because, well, first of all, it'd be very difficult, to label accurately, but it's difficult to label just about anything accurately, as you're pointing out. But to at least take a stab at it, like you do with any other food, and people would see that it contains all of these things that we need. But because it doesn't have a label, people can project onto that food whatever beliefs they have about whether it's nutritious or not or dangerous.
So many lines to chase down. So in Little Shop of Horrors, you talked about some of the anti-nutrients and other components. And not only are plants green, but they're friendly, and the birds are singing and the sun is shining and it's all wonderful. But there's a reason that those anti-nutrient compounds are in those plant source foods.
Mm-hmm. There is. So, every creature, every living creature needs to defend itself. Every living creature is trying to take over the world, and we're all competing with each other. So, plants can't defend themselves by growling or chasing or running away. They're sitting ducks, but they're not defenseless, and they're not innocent. They're armed with chemical weapons and primarily to fend off tiny things, like things like worms and bacteria and fungi, but to fight off living things with living cells. And they're very, very good at it. That's how they've evolved. I mean, they've been around a lot longer than we have. So they've evolved these very sophisticated chemical weapons, and we have evolved alongside these plants, to be clear, and we have mechanisms in our bodies if we're healthy, if we have a healthy gut lining, if we have a healthy immune system, we are designed to be able to process a lot of these plant toxins, and either not absorb them or minimally absorb them, and or rapidly eliminate them. We treat them not as welcome nutrients. We treat them as uninvited guests, and we get rid of them as fast as humanly possible. So. That's what evolution has done. It said, okay, this is bad for us. Let's figure out a way to get rid of it. So it will welcome in the vitamins and minerals, but it won't welcome in the toxins. And the strange thing about these toxins is that, if you were to talk with somebody who believes that we need to eat a very high plant diet, you will actually hear some people defend these plant toxins as beneficial in some strange way. And one of the best ways they love to do that is by saying, oh, that has antioxidant properties. This chemical weapon, let's say that it's a neurotoxin, which in the nightshades contain neurotoxins, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors that poison the nervous system. And that has an antioxidant. They'll say that there's an antioxidant properties to a lot of these plant compounds. Now, that's true in a test tube, but it's not true in the human body. So if you take most plant antioxidants, unless it's a vitamin like vitamin C that we welcome in because we need it, um, unless you unless it's a vitamin, if it's a non-essential nutrient and it's a plant antioxidant, like, I don't know, curcumin or phytic acid, something in plants that we can see from piles of literature is potentially risky to the human body or anti-nutritional. And you can, it may have antioxidant properties or anti-cancer properties. It might be good at killing cancer cells in a test tube. And then they say, well, that must mean that it's good for us. And not only can we not absorb a lot of these things, but if we could, they could be harmful. And so it's really the lengths that people will go to defend this myth about these non-essential plant compounds is really striking. And I think it just speaks to the power of emotion and belief over logic, and that human beings are largely driven by emotions. We're capable of logic, but feelings matter, and what we believe can really seem very true, and we can come up with ways to justify or rationalize. We're very good at rationalizing.
No, I'm not. What do you mean by that? What are you suggesting?
And we all have to. I mean, all of us, even those of us who understand or at least think we understand the important benefits of animal foods, even those of us who defend animal foods in the human diet, that they belong in a human diet, we have to watch out for the very same thing. But I do think that it's very, very important not to examine just other people's, other people's beliefs and wishes about what's true about food, but also to examine our own and make sure we hold ourselves to a really high standard. Because what we really want here, it's not about being right. It's not about, getting more followers. It's about human health. It's about improving public health and the quality of human health, mental health, physical health. And it's important to keep getting closer and closer to what's true.
Yeah, I was struck by your opening conflict of interest slides in the two talks that I most recently reviewed. And I too, although I may fall short of my own goal, I'm not interested in us and them. I'm not interested in diet wars. It's all us. There is no them.
Yes,
And
right.
it absolutely, like I said before, when it comes to the actual nutrient content, if somebody is wanting to follow a plant-only diet, and that's a point I want to come right back to, I'm not convinced that they've got the information they need to do that properly, which means that with their sincere desire to do something, they may very well be harming themselves in some way. Now, there's lots of things people can do that harm themselves, and I'm not interested in controlling anyone's behavior, but the information needs to be gotten out there, and it isn't. That's just very clear. The necessary information has not been well communicated. The point that I'd like to kind of maybe at least throw out there, and you can come back at me later about it, is why do we call omnivorous vegetarian? Because if I'm understanding, I've got carnivore, I've got vegan, I've got omnivore. But because and you, if you want to speculate about it or whatever, why do we use that word as opposed to omnivore?
Oh, yes. That's a really, really interesting question. I've never thought about that before. It's a really interesting question. It's funny what kind of slips by, what we kind of, just absorb and never think about. And that's an example. I've never thought about that question. So, because as you know, vegetarians do eat animal foods, but they don't eat animals direct, they eat animal products, but they don't eat the animals themselves. And I think for some people that makes a really huge difference in their comfort level with their diet. But a vegetarian diet, which means, a diet that includes plants and eggs and or dairy is a extremely different diet, so different from a vegan diet because it contains animal foods. It is a far healthier diet, much easier to construct properly. And I know many, many, many healthy vegetarians. It's harder for me to think of somebody who eats an all plant diet who doesn't have health problems of one kind or another, but I don't know everybody. But I will say, I will say that I have had very, very healthy vegetarian patients over the years. But I struggle to think of a single person who eats an entirely plant-based diet, entirely like all plant diet.
And of course, then there are the ovo, lacto, pesco, pollo versions of, but they always want to tack that in front of vegetarian. And it's just something that I've been wrestling with how to put my arms around that. I think I have some ideas, but they're not terribly informed. So I just seeking input at this point.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you can construct just about any diet to be healthy or unhealthy. If you don't have the right information, any diet can be unhealthy. You can even construct an unhealthy carnivore diet. Oh, yeah. And it's about knowing what your body needs. And about sort of optimizing, maximizing the good stuff and minimizing the bad stuff, and making sure you get everything you need. So I love what you said about this, us versus them. It's all us. We are all in this together, trying to figure out what's true. And I think that it's very, very unfortunate that sometimes some influencers in the field of nutrition on all sides of the debate don't always give people all the information they need. They'll give them some of the information, but not all of the information. And that can be really dangerously misleading.
I don't know if you're the one that used the plant biased or if it was someone else. I know I got planty nutrients from you. That was it. I don't want to use brand names, but there's a certain product made from pomegranates. And it's promoted as giving you all these antioxidants. And you could look at blueberries as another one. But then you said something about just how much of that we can actually even absorb.
Oh yeah, it's minuscule. It's infinitesimally small. I'm going to say the brand name. It's Palm Wonderful.
Okay.
Palm Wonderful comes in this sexy, curvy bottle, $4 or $5 a bottle. I don't know what it is now.
God bless America. I'm jealous.
What can I bottle? So it's it touts itself as having these cancer fighting, antioxidant rich, loaded with powerful disease fighting antioxidants, and it is loaded with antioxidants, but they are plant antioxidants, and we either don't absorb them at all, or we rapidly transform them into something else before they even have a chance to be absorbed. So the absorption rate is something like, don't quote me on this, it's either 0.01% or 0.001%, something very, very, very small. And so, you're getting antioxidants, but it's in the bottle, but your body can't access them. And to make matters worse, and this is such a common problem, what else is in that bottle with those antioxidants? And it's an entire bottle of sugar. I think it's like 32 grams of sugar. And sugar is a powerful pro-oxidant. It's a promoter of oxidation. So, and you're going to absorb every molecule of that. So you've got, an entire bottle full of pro-oxidants and then a teeny tiny bit of antioxidant. And so how is that? It's actually, you're buying the exact opposite of what you're being told you're buying. And this is a huge, huge problem. across the board. Most antioxidant supplements and most antioxidant products are paired with sugar.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
And nobody ever talks about
yes.
taking the pro-oxidants out of your diet. They talk about adding the antioxidants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of, I wonder why that would be. So the other part of the plant-based diet that I react badly to is the simple fact that humanity is already on a plant-based diet. The majority of our energy is coming from plants globally. The majority of humanity's protein, and I'm putting air quotes around that word, is coming from plants. Wheat is the single largest source of protein in humanity's diet.
Really?
Really. Single largest source. Humanity gets more of its protein from cereals than from all the animal source foods combined.
Wow.
And you got to put the air quotes around protein, because when we have plants, what we're really talking about, and people have heard me talk about this before, is it's crude protein. That's the official designation. We just, kind of clean it up for the label. We're running out of space, so we'll just put protein in there. It's not really protein. It's not amino acids. It's any nitrogenous material. It's any nitrogen in the food sample multiplied by 6.25 to estimate its crude protein content. We've been doing it since the 1880s, roughly. We got lots of data. It's okay with ruminants. It's not okay with simple stomached animals, and the swine industry ain't been doing that for 40 years. Might be time for us to change.
Why break with tradition?
Well, yes, exactly. And tradition has served us so well. But this is the thing that I mean when I say that I'm really convinced that people don't have the information they need to do what they're trying to and think they're doing. I mean, that they've been told, and so they're trying to do that, and it's just not going to work. And then it ripples out when you start looking at bigger questions like food systems and addressing food security on a global basis. And then you have people like Eat Lancet come forward, and they're not addressing any of this, let alone all the games that they're playing by admitting that their plant-only diet is not appropriate for the vast majority of human beings. And yet they, at the same time, will be promoting a plant-only diet. It gets frustrating at some point, but again, I'm trying to train myself to be a pleasant human being and just deal with the information. What have you been up to? Looking back, I don't think I've seen you since Low Carb Denver in 19.
Yeah, I haven't seen you either. I haven't seen anybody.
Well, yeah.
It's really sad. I mean, I miss seeing people. I miss, going to meetings and talking with you and my other colleague friends and with people from around the world who attend these conferences and just make them so much fun and such vibrant places for exchanges of ideas. I really miss that. Hopefully we'll get back to that world someday. But I've been using the time that I'm not been, traveling and making presentations and so forth. There's been a silver lining, which is that I've been able to focus on some other projects that have been really on the back burner and I've long wanted to work on. So I started a virtual practice. So I do consults with nutritional psychiatry consults. And I've been doing that for a couple of years now. And that's really grown and it's really been a tremendous source of, it's been very rewarding and interesting. And really, I've learned a lot. I learned from everybody that I consult with. And it's really enriched my, my clinical knowledge. And the other thing I've done is I've put together, created an online training program for mental health clinicians who are interested in learning how to use nutritional psychiatry, the principles of nutritional psychiatry and ketogenic diets in their clinical practices. And they're like small virtual online classes, like 4 to 6 people per class. And, and that has been really wonderful. Again, I learned from everybody who takes the class, but I've put it together to address a lot of the, not just the sort of the science and the safety questions about ketogenic diets, and but also the practical elements of how do you safely use these diets in clinical practice. A lot of clinical wisdom that goes into that class. So I mean, I've really been enjoying that. So I wouldn't have been able to. It was a lot of work to put that course together, and I wouldn't have had the time or the sort of the bandwidth to be able to really sit and put that together, because it took many months to put it together. And so those are some new things that I'm doing, really focusing a lot recently on clinical, and even getting involved in some research projects too. So hopefully once the world starts spinning on its correct axis again, there'll be new things to share with people, from this clinical work. So I look forward to that at some point. But what have you been doing? And I mean, I haven't seen you for so long, and I'm so accustomed to. I don't even have to plan it. I'm so accustomed to seeing you wherever I go. What's going on in Western Oregon, and are you working during the pandemic? How's that all working out for you?
Well, so fortunately, my day job is in agriculture. Agriculture has been deemed an essential industry.
Uh-huh.
So now I haven't been in the office but about 3 days out of the last however many months now. I mean, um, so there's that. Um, I must admit that I went through a significant period of just, ugh, really? I mean, just the calendar got flushed, and there
Yeah.
were some significant things that seemed to be in the offing, and they just kind of changed. And it took me a while to kind of, okay, now what? And this effort started back in November with the Sodcast, and that's been good on a number of levels. One, the response from people, but two, getting to see people again and have conversations and feed my brain, which it was not getting fed, the isolation. I am part of communities in recovery, and those took a big hit.
Oh, yeah.
We always meet in churches. Well, they kept the liquor store open, but they closed the church.
Isn't that something?
So in the summer it was okay. We could meet out on the back lawn, but spring and fall in Oregon, probably you need to so we're fortunate we have a couple, so that got back into pattern, so that's good. um so there are a couple things that I'd love to talk about maybe offline, because but the biggest one is I get to be part of the program committee for an international conference. The International Grasslands Congress will meet in 2023 in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Hmm.
And this will draw people from all over the world potentially. And the title of this is Grasslands for Soil, Animal, and Human Health.
I like it.
So I'm looking for people that can, help review papers in submission. I'm looking for people to be plenary speakers. We'll be announcing by the time this episode comes out. We'll have started putting out first call for papers, And again, these are government, these are institution, these are not so many producers except from the US. So that's one of the efforts that I get to be a part of. And again, trying to build these bridges between, across the production to consumption span. I mean, this is a
Hmm.
huge area with all these not little, all these disciplines, and we're not good at talking with each other. And I think we have the emergence of a really good story from beginning through public health. I
That's
just,
great. I mean, 'cause who better? I mean, this is an area of passion for you and deep knowledge, and so bringing people together to tell that story that needs to be told. It's good.
yeah. So some good things, some good things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's always a silver lining around every
Yeah, there's got to
cloud.
be a pony in here someplace, right? You know that joke? You do know what I'm referencing, right?
No, I just thought it was a cute saying. What are you
Um,
referencing?
little boy comes into his bedroom and he finds a massive pile of horse manure and
Uh,
he's all excited. Sorry.
that's funny.
Um, so that's an optimist.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that's a good skill to have these days. Optimism.
exactly. Well, and partly too, I'm getting to know people who are doing work overseas.
Hmm.
And that was a question I thought to ask you. You went to, was it Indonesia?
Yes.
And that was back in 2019, was it?
Yes, it was April 2019. It was an amazing experience.
Yes.
I was, uh, I don't know. I don't even know. Is it, unless you have something specific you want to ask me? I mean, there's so much I could say about that
Mm,
experience. It's been, uh, the people. I mean, the people that I met there were so full of love and so full of energy and enthusiasm. And there's an enormous low carb community in Indonesia. It was started by one person, Tio Prasetyo, and he started Keto Fastosis Indonesia. And I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of people that belong to this organization, but helping people get healthy by telling them the truth about food.
mhm.
And it's just an incredible community. Um, and it's just, yeah, I still, feel very, I was really, really moved by my experience there. There's just a whole different culture
Mhm.
in Southeast Asia of, how people interact with each other. And there's just so much joy and just no, I don't know. It just felt so good. Like people seemed, and I could be wrong, but they seemed happier than most of us, it feels to me, are in our culture. There's just a lot more closeness, a lot more connection, a lot more sort of, the priorities are different.
Mhm. I'm so glad to hear, and I'm glad you had that opportunity. And the little bit that I've done to get out and see a wider reality. And again, it's part of the animation of this is something that transforms lives. And it's not big, utopian top-down vision. It's the helping your neighbor kind of approach, which speaks to me. And so getting again, trying to take the message from you and your colleagues and introduce that message to my agricultural tribe. Because when I go to those meetings and look around, it's like, well, the statistics pretty average. I mean, um, and then I think agriculture has a story that hasn't been well enough told, and
Hmm.
especially the ruminant animal agriculture tribe that I'm most familiar with. And so these same mythologies that you mentioned about nutrition, I would say plus or minus exist in other messages that people are subjected to, and it's used to reinforce the story that for whatever reason, as you acknowledge, there seems to be something going on here. And it could be because there are new businesses that are trying to launch. It could be because of belief systems that this is a fundamental part of. It could be any number of things, and I don't want to get into any of that. I'm not qualified. How much fertilizer do you need to apply to your crop? That's what I'm qualified for. So I'm always best when I remember my qualifications. So I've asked you. I love the time. I love the conversation, and I wish we could go on further, but you've been very generous, and I know you're busy. But if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me specifically, it would only be fair to give you the chance.
I would love. So one of the things that's always been hard for me, that I've never delved into enough, and I know that you'll know the answer to this, and it's something that so many of my patients ask me and my colleagues, and it's not something that I've had time to delve into, and I might not even understand if I did. So can you help me understand, because this is the difference between a grass-fed animal and a grain-fed animal. Let's take a cow, a grass-fed cow and a grain-fed cow. Can you kind of boil down for me and anybody else who's listening, what are the differences nutritionally between those two animals, if there are any?
Yeah.
And I've never been able to really articulate that very well.
Okay. So the very shortest version that I can give you is that the literature has reports of quantitative differences in a number of substances. Those are variable. They're not in any way consistent. And what we don't have is the biological significance of those differences. Okay. In some cases, those differences are pretty small, even with the variability. You take the mean and you can compare it to the mean, and it's like, really, I don't think so. One of the for example, there's a lot of concern about the plant omega-6 content in meat, and one of the benefits of ruminant animals is because of the rumen, their fatty acid composition will always be less impacted by diet than swine or poultry or fish will be.
Huh.
And so beef or goat or lamb or what have you is not a rich source of either omega-3 or omega-6 when you look at it compared to other foodstuffs in our diet. So people have looked at vitamin E content, people have looked at carotene content, they've looked at saturated fat content for a while. People were convinced that saturated fat was bad. They even tried to look at cholesterol content and make claims. And again, a lot of these sort of pro claims started a little further back in the era of fat causes heart disease and dietary cholesterol is a risk factor. So it all got confounded with that message as well. So that's a brief introduction into it. I think one of the graphics I've used shows the omega-6, and I think I'm right on this, that omega-6s are all classed together, whether they're from plants or animals, and they're counted equivalent, just like with omega-3. And so you see those listed in a table. And then even if you look at the grain finished beef, and then over here you have walnuts, and you had to break the scale to make the bar for the omega-6 from, a handful of walnuts show up. So whatever you think you're achieving by going for grass finished or grass fed, you best not be eating some other foods that frequently would be considered perfectly okay because you're going to be consuming far more of the omega-6 from those foods.
Yeah. So is there, aside from, I would imagine, the health of the planet and the health of the animals, um, is there any, in your opinion, let's just take your opinion. In your opinion, is there any nutritional benefit for the human being to eat a grass-fed animal over a grain-fed animal?
I'm not convinced by the data,
Okay.
especially when we're dealing with a population that's so sick to begin with.
Well, it goes without saying.
You know, if
And
it,
I think that I hear what you're saying, which is that if there were any differences, they're just a drop in the bucket compared to, all of the other influences in the diet, which which sort of overshadow whatever minor differences there. And as far as you know, there no other interesting differences between the two.
no, really. And again, I use that example of the wooden barrel with the different length staves in it.
Yes, I've seen that. That's neat.
Okay.
Yeah.
So until we address the hyperinsulinemia, until we address the essential fatty acid, the protein deficiencies, all of that, it's somewhere, I'm sure I can see something showing up, but we're not there. And I'm convinced most people, the vast majority of people, are not there either. So, and just, health of the planet wise, that's even something that we could push back if we had the time. The shortest version that I can give you is many people think that grass-fed has lower emissions than, grain finished. And the reality of a ruminant is the more fiber, the less digestible the ration, the higher the methane emissions. Now, we can
Mm-hmm.
do lots of things, and we're working on that. But just again, people have a vision, and oftentimes that vision doesn't line up with the reality.
Yeah, so thanks, because I'm always trying to understand that better. But don't spend as much time thinking about it or learning about it as you do.
Well, you've got more than enough on your plate. One of my lines is when you improve your health, you are improving the world. And so if each of us would, and the converse of that is frequently the people that talk the loudest about saving the world, changing the world, are doing it to distract themselves from doing the hard, humbling work of changing themselves.
Hmm.
Right. And
Hmm.
if we would do that work each individually, yeah, the world would be a better place. That's my sort of approach. But if we could get people to value their own health more, and I would suggest appropriately, then a lot of other things would just kind of
Yeah.
shift.
I mean, it is true that, when patients ask me, a lot of people make an assumption that in order to follow a keto diet or a low carb diet or a paleo diet or a carnivore diet, that the animal foods need to be of a very, very high quality and expensive and so forth. And I do think ideally that would be great. I do think that would be, best, but not everybody can afford that and not everybody has access.
Yeah.
And I would rather, I usually will say, I'd rather have you having some high quality animal protein in your diet, to meet your nutritional needs, even if it's not perfect, even if it's not the perfect animal food. Um, than to have something that's going to raise your blood sugar and insulin levels instead. I mean, that's a no-brainer for me, like comparing those two. So, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
But I think that, I still advise people, and I don't have a lot of science to back this up. It just sort of intuitively makes sense to me. Maybe I'm making a mistake there. That that it would be nice if all of the animals on the planet, including ourselves, would eat the diet we were meant to eat, whatever that means. So, if that's even possible, but or coming as coming as close as we can. But we
Sure,
don't
of
live in that
course.
world.
Yeah,
Humans don't live in that world. Animals don't live in that
yeah,
world. But yeah,
yeah.
thanks.
I
That's
mean, some
interesting.
things in theory make sense, but you live in Massachusetts. I live in Philomath, Oregon, so we don't live in theory. Um, I
Are you in the
would.
part of Oregon that was affected by the wildfires over the summer?
Oh,
Where were
yes,
you?
very much so.
Yeah,
About 40 or so miles away were some big ones, so we got a lot of smoke. Fortunately, that's all we had to deal with. But
yeah, yeah.
um, I would, try to respectfully explore the quality conversation because
Hmm.
I'm not sure that that's well enough defined for people to be making a lot of the statements that they're making, especially when we know that there are people for whom the management is not the issue. The issue for them is that you are consuming animal source food and they don't think that should happen. Period.
Oh,
Full
I
stop.
recognize that. Yeah,
And
I
so,
recognize that.
so, but then in addition to that, I think that a lot of the quality um, perceptions aren't well founded.
Mm,
And so we may be scaring people away from exactly what they need to be eating that's most affordable and accessible to them without good reason. And maybe there is something there that needs attention. Let's just have an open conversation about it. For example, the whole question of processed foods, right? We class processed animal products with processed plant products.
right, right.
And when I spoke with the meat scientist from North Dakota State University, and he tells me that when we take meat and we make bologna out of it, or salami, or bacon, we actually increase its digestible, indispensable amino acid score. We make it more nutritious.
Hmm.
Oh, well, this is cool because now we can take a lower value product and maybe even give it some shelf stability, make it more accessible to people. And so now this whole question about good and whatever takes on a whole new appearance to me. Um, and then one last thing, from my perspective is, um, in the whole conversation about sustainability, we have yet to give an honest consideration to the burden of chronic illness, whether that's physical, whether that's mental. Okay. And one estimate is that if the typical type 2 diabetic in America could get off their medication, oh, gee, what would that be? In any case, if that were so, okay, speculating wildly, if that could happen, they would reduce their greenhouse gas emission footprint 29% more than if they shifted from a high meat to a vegan diet.
Hmm.
Essentially, the equivalent of taking a car off the road. Gee, I wonder why we're not talking about that. But in
Well,
any,
I think that's also important to talk about. Yeah, no, it's uh, I understand the sort of the theory of relativity there. So, yeah.
Hmm. So there's just lots, like I said before, there's lots of good news. There's lots of good news, and we need good news.
We sure
The,
do.
the good news was that you accepted the invitation, so thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. The invitation, Peter. It's really nice to connect, and hello to everybody who's watching. It's nice to see you. I wish I could see you, but I hope everybody's doing well and holding up okay. And hopefully we'll all see each other again soon.
Real soon.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Thank you, Georgia.